Yeah. Okay.
I'll read this.
Yep.
Yeah. So welcome again to everyone to the general session. I'll read the land acknowledgement. Waterfront Toronto acknowledges that the land on which we are undertaking our revitalization effort is part of the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In addition, Waterfront Toronto acknowledges that Toronto has historically been a gathering of many and including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today, including all of us. So, thank you for that. Leon has a few updates that he wants to share, I believe.
Yes. So just to go over the agenda today, it's straightforward. We start at 3 o'clock. We're running a little bit behind.
Yeah.
So the team will start their presentation at 3:10. It'll be a slightly longer presentation because it's a master plan presentation. And then we'll go into Q&A, comments, and we'll take a vote at the end. Report back on last month's projects. So last month we saw the Keating Channel Pedestrian Bridge come for their first DRP review. The team has submitted 100% schematic design package earlier this month, and they have also presented the project to the Accessibility Advisory Committee for comments, and we're expecting to see them return for their Stage 2 schematic design review in September this year. We also saw West Donlands 15. So they came for Stage 2 schematic design. They received a non-support vote, so we are expecting the team to return later this fall to redo the same stage. A couple of Waterfront Toronto updates. Earlier this month, we had members of the Waterfront Accessibility Advisory Committee come for a tour of East Bayfront to review and provide feedback on the existing design of the public realm in the area. The feedback will inform the Waterfront Accessibility Design Guidelines and ideally all future Waterfront Toronto design choices. Some of the key findings include edges must be clearly defined, tactile is best, curb cuts provide a major decision points and on desire lines, lighting, seating, picnic tables. So the guidelines themselves will come to the DRP as a for information item later this year. In terms of public art updates, so we've noted both of these projects to you last month already, but you will also be receiving, the DRP will be receiving a formal invitation for the community event for the floating art piece on Thursday, August 15th, and also for the AHT public art piece in Equilibrium. The teams are working towards the formal unveiling, targeting later fall this year, and also formal invites will be sent out to DRP members once the details are finalized. Chris, would you like to talk about the removal of the...
Oh, well, yes. So we had a small event that some of you actually attended to remove what's called the west plug, which is the wall, not quite where that buoy line is, but not too far from there, that separated the New River channel from the lake. So the water body here is the Polson Slip, which is connected to the lake. The wall was taken out over a number of days, but that now means the New River channel is not a bathtub, it's now part of the lake system. And so we had an Indigenous ceremony, a water ceremony, along with speeches from several elected officials, just to kind of mark that one milestone. It was a very nice event, fairly small event, because really the big event's going to be when we take the north plug out, and then the whole river is then a functioning river system, and that's when we will have flood protection formally in place. So this was really kind of an intermediate, smaller event. That next one will be bigger. And then the opening of the PLFP parks will be even a much bigger event after that.
Just one question. Do we have a date yet when the north plug comes out? Because I'm
No,
sure a lot
not
of
a
us,
date yet. It's gonna be in the fall sometime.
but
Yeah,
we will all know. of
Yeah,
it. I'm
yeah.
sure a lot of us would want to be there.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Okay.
This is one of the play pieces that's gone in. This is the owl, which is actually a stage for kids. So it's, you can't quite see it in the photo, but it's actually got a stage at the ground floor. And then it's got seating outside so kids could actually put on a play. This was just installed about a week ago. The head just went on. It's very big. It's all wood. It's quite beautiful. And that's part of the sequence of play features that are in this part of the park, not part of the destination play park, which is made up of a lot more pieces and a lot higher density of play, and actually will feel more like a playground. This is kind of an area with some play in it. Pretty amazing. The Badlands is also part of this, which is shaping up quite nicely. If anyone has questions about that, they can ask Emily. Anyway, this was kind of a nice milestone moment.
Great. Okay, just to wrap up here, quick look at the next 2 months DRP agenda. So for September, I mentioned before, Keating Channel Pedestrian Bridge is scheduled to come back for their stage 2 review. Also on the agenda is Waterfront East LRT, the 2A segment, Young Slip, coming back for the 3rd stage detailed design review. We're planning to have our annual DRP walking tour also at around that time. For October, we have many projects. We have a few McCleary District projects, so 685 Lakeshore Boulevard East, 120 Bouchette, 115 Salter, all of which are coming for stage 1 issues ID. And we're holding a slot for a PAC review item. Waiting lists, we have West Islands Block 13 coming back for schematic design, and potentially McCleary District, same team that's here today, would return for their final stage 3 review. We're also looking at the new precinct plan work starting at Keating Channel East. So that would be a 1st stage issues ID review. And then finally, the other segment of Waterfront East LRT 2C, Cherry Street, Commissioners Villas Loop, also scheduled to come back later this year.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we're a little bit behind, but not bad. So we'll move into the one main item we have, McCleary District Precinct Plan, preliminary draft plan. And I believe Colin Wolf is going to do the introduction. Oh, behind me.
Thanks, Paul.
There, sorry.
Okay. We have Scott Pennington from ATO who's going to kick us off, and then Julie and I from the city will contribute to the staff comment.
Yes, that's correct. So I'm going to share my screen and I will advance the slides for you, Colin.
Okay.
Oh, Scott.
Thanks, Liam. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yep.
we can hear you.
Okay. And first off, my sincere apologies for not being there in person. I had every intention of doing so until I hit a wall of rain leaving Union Station. Didn't have my swimsuit, so I had to turn around and find an office space here. So I'll certainly be there for the next one. My name is Scott Pennington. I'm the Vice President responsible for Portland's management at CraigTO. My team is working very closely with city planning and Waterfront Toronto staff to implement this precinct plan. So I'm only going to take a few moments to make some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to hand it over to Julie and Colin to give some further context from the city planning side, and then we're going to hand it over to our very capable consultant team to kind of walk you through the work that they've been doing. We're very excited to come back to the panel and present the work that's been underway since we were last in front of you in March. What you're going to see today is some further exploration, emerging directions, options testing in response to the commentary that we received back from Design Review Panel, as well as additional engagement and feedback that we've had over the last number of months. And we really look forward to your additional feedback before we return back in the fall with a preferred concept for McCleary. Leon, I think you can advance the slide. I think I've more or less gone through the agenda, so I won't linger on this one. You can advance. Leon, I'm wondering if maybe you're showing the consultant's deck here.
I apologize.
All good. I think the first slide should be just some context setting. While you tee that up, I'll just carry on because I know we don't want to spend too much time on intros. But when we talk about the McCleary district, just as a reminder to folks, we're talking about a 40-acre or 16.5-hectare area on the east side of the Portlands, just to the east of the Dawn roadway. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And so we see this as a tremendous opportunity, in large part, not just because of the location, but also because of the public ownership that exists here. So of that 16.5 hectares I mentioned, about 13.5 hectares are under public ownership, primarily under Créteil ownership, but also by the city as well. You'll hear from some of the private landowners in the coming months in terms of the concepts that they have for McCleary, and we're hopeful that it'll all coalesce into kind of a coherent vision for this area. The opportunity for McCleary, again, as everybody's aware, is really unlocked by the Portlands Flood Protection Project. This is a little bit of an outdated image, as Chris has mentioned. The northern plug is imminently going to be removed, and so there is already water immediately to the west of this site, and the river will be free flowing in a matter of months. And so that's, you know, the opportunity that we see in terms of obviously this area now being flood protected, but also the adjacency to these natural assets is something that we take very seriously. We are guided, and I know Julie and Colin will go through this, but I want to reiterate this from a Créteil perspective as well. We are really, truly, and wholly guided by the work that was done through the Portlands planning framework, both before 2017 and after, through negotiations with various different stakeholders. So we have a very strong policy foundation that we're working with as we advance this work. Leon, you can advance the next slide. So as we look at this geography, we're well aware of that we're really staring at one of, if not the largest growth centers for downtown over the coming decades. And McCleary District is really situated at the nexus of that. We know, based on recent plans that have been before council, obviously Villiers Island, or New Island as we call it, until there is a new name in place, a substantial amount of density is going to be coming online there in the coming decades, as reflected in the recently adopted precinct plan, 800,000 square feet of GFA, 9,000 units. That's something that we are being very kind of cognizant of. To the north, the East Harbor development, an additional 1.2 million square meters worth of density, a significant portion of that, and potentially, well, I won't comment, but a significant portion of that right now is residential, primarily though employment. And then to the south, and this is something at Créteil we are very kind of attentive to, given the importance of the film industry. These are, we have Pinewood to the immediate south, and then the Basin Studios development, which has been in front of you recently, to the southeast. And collectively, when we look at these developments plus the rest of the studio operations in the area, we're talking about the largest purpose-built film cluster in the GTA. Right today, there's 34 sound stages. In the future, there will be 54 sound stages. There's 1 million square feet of sound stage and ancillary film-related uses. In the future, there will be 2 million. So that number is just intended to grow with the further build out of Basin Studios and Pinewood expansion in the future, and other plans that are in the works. So this is something that we know is really important to be sensitive to and protect for. So when we talk about McCleary, some people might talk about, well, the importance of buffers and that sort of thing. Really, we think about this as a key transition zone between the conventional mixed use that we might see to the west and to a certain extent to the north, really to these more industrial or commercial employment zones to the south and to the east. And we really want to make sure that McCleary not just is sensitive to those range of uses, but also complementing them in a number of ways. So we've been in front, I'll just note that we've been in front of the Film, Television, and Media Advisory Board at the city a number of times to keep them apprised of this work. We were just in front of them about 2 weeks ago. I think these are constructive discussions that we're having. We received some requests for consideration as a part of the plan, which we're now making sure that we're being accountable to ensure that there isn't a negative impact. And in fact, as I say, that we can really support the growth and future of film in this area. So that's an additional lens through which we're looking at the precinct plan. Leon, you can advance. Okay, and then the last slide for me, and then I'll hand it over. Just in terms of where we are in our process. So again, as we talked about at the first meeting, the intention or our work plan this year is focused on delivering this precinct plan alongside enabling zoning and an OPA for a phase 1 area. And just as a reminder, the phase 1 area accounts for the entirety of the Créteil owned properties at the far west. So if you see those 6 blocks on the image there at the far western extent, those are all under Créteil ownership. The remaining blocks in phase 1 are the private blocks. And so the desire is that alongside the private applications that are going forward, we can put forward a planning framework that reflects the city's intentions and is, our hope, something that the private applicants can get behind as well. In the future, and we're hoping that this won't be delayed too long, we would advance work on phase 2, but there are some contingencies there in terms of some EA work related to the Broadview extension and some other roadways that we need to make sure is sufficiently far advanced before we move forward with that phase 2 work. In terms of timelines, as mentioned, we've been in front of DRP already this year. We're very happy to be here again today. We will be returning again in the fall. We will be also looking to have our first open public consultation targeting September or October on the project. And then we are aiming towards December report to Planning and Housing Committee with the preferred precinct plan and enabling planning documents. So that's the big picture. Now I want to kind of hand it over to Julie and Colin to kind of go through some of the additional considerations from the city side, and then over to our consultant team to let you know where they're at. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everyone. And so Scott mentioned that we're kind of staying true to the policy documents and the planning framework. And we did a lot of soul searching about what was set out in that document versus what is more flexible and what we can play with through the precinct plan. And so we determined that what is fixed are the major streets, the height peak along Commissioners, from Lakeshore to Commissioners, the 40-meter tower separation, policies supporting a sunny and inviting public realm, and then the PIC, and then finally the view corridor. So those are the things that we're not really going to touch. And then in terms of what we're testing is the local street character, the open space network in terms of where the park is going to be located, density and height, building typology, and then PIC in terms of the overall percentage that we're going to be exploring on each block, and potentially consolidating PIC on city lands. And then additional considerations are the airport flight path, noise and air quality, and then sustainability. Go to the next one. In terms of the Indigenous engagement strategy, I'm sharing an image from work that's being done on the Portlands from the Indigenous engagement approach. So far we've been talking with the First Nations and Indigenous orgs. We've spoken to the urban Indigenous residents and other Indigenous organizations and experts. And so there have been a lot of conversations on the Portlands with the First Nations. However, on McCleary, there have been capacity issues and resource issues preventing us from having detailed discussions on McCleary specifically. The current focus with these groups is on the renaming of Villiers, and First Nations have been more interested in talking about citywide relationships than project-specific information such as McCleary. And so far, the Waterfront Secretariat has met with the Six Nations, and they shared a few slides about McCleary, but there were no specific comments. And they have requested meetings with the MCFN and the TASC, and hopefully those meetings will happen in the fall. So stay tuned on that. Next slide, please. And then finally on Indigenous engagement, we took a look at what we've heard so far through previous engagements, and the themes have been prioritizing environment and climate change, housing and intensification, placemaking and placekeeping. And the way we see that aligning in terms of McCleary and what we're working on through the Reconciliation Action Plan is that we're supporting Indigenous health and well-being, access to affordable housing, placekeeping, supporting art and culture, and supporting the revitalization of Indigenous languages, and improving economic development. And so while it's been a challenge to consult with the First Nations on McCleary on the specifics of the precinct plan, we've been looking back at past engagement, for example, on the PIC core guidelines, and trying to understand how some of those suggestions could inform McCleary. And some themes that I think are relevant are the importance of water stewardship and representing Indigenous culture in the public realm. And so we're kind of seeing this land in two buckets. So, what are the specific things we can engage with on the precinct plan? And then what are the things that we continue to engage with the First Nations on through detailed design and as the area kind of gets built out over the coming years and decades. So I think that's good. I'll hand it off to Colin.
Thanks, Julie. I'll be brief. I know we've got a lot of slides to go through and a lot of content that I think you'll find interesting. On the sustainability plan, what will be built out a little bit further in the presentations is we know that roads and right of ways will be doing a lot of work in terms of prioritizing walking, cycling, public transit, as well as the landscape and biophilic design, detailed design. The right of ways can take a lot of that on, and we see a strong role for the roads within the network. As well as buildings and landscape also being critical, and this idea of circular economy and solid waste, something we're looking to implementing in demonstration sites, potentially in a community hub coming forward. So that deliverable of the McCleary District Sustainability Plan is coming down soon as we have a better sense of height and density for the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So as you heard from us last time, there's three applications before the city. Within the private lands, there's one other private site within the phase 1 of the district. And we know from those discussions, mostly to do through the OLT process, there's a few highlighted issues that are coming up as we try to knit together the private applications and the precinct planning work. They're supposed to be proceeding in parallel. That's what our policy tells us to do. So those things are happening and they're informing each other. And we know things like how much productions in interactive space we're able to incorporate in those private sites is a major issue. The street network, tower separation, and affordable housing, we know are all key pieces that continue to inform those discussions and come cross-pollinate between the precinct plan and these private applications. Next slide, please. So I'm going to lay out briefly some of the edge conditions, knowing that these streets aren't within the purview and the scope of work of the police precinct plan, but it gives a helpful context as to what we're seeing there. But before I do that, I did want to outlay that a big part of the context for this area is about infrastructure, specifically the Commissioner Street pumping station, which could be give or take 10 years to get online. So the Commissioner Street pumping station is a major piece, as well as some of the air and noise and land use compatibility pieces. So the full build out for this district could be happening between 2035 and well into the 2040s. So it's very important to keep that in mind as we go through this process and think about how the district will roll out in the fullness of time. So for the first edge, Lakeshore, I'm not going to spend too much time on it here, apart from there's a rebalancing effort. This is tied to the Gardner improvements, and we're looking at public realm improvements, Civic Boulevard, and continuous landscape identity. That said, it's still going to be 6 lanes. It's still going to be a very busy and wide right of way, but it's going to be better balanced towards pedestrians and different modes of transportation. Next slide. The Dawn roadway is a river's edge street identity. It's really interesting, and you don't see a whole lot of this kind of condition within the city. Prioritizing views and linkages to the trail system. And I know some of our consultants are going to get into this, but there is a higher elevation for this street to protect from major storm events coming forward, and how that knits together with the grade changes in the district is something to consider. So that's part of the unique features we're seeing on the Dawn roadway. Next slide, please. Commissioners is a good example of a right-of-way that's doing a lot of work in terms of blue-green infrastructure, in terms of incorporating the kind of truck movements that will support the industrial uses that are there now, and we want to continue to see happening south of us. Streetcar and a right-of-way and active transportation. So that roadway is doing a lot of work, and it is subject to future EA. And finally, the Broadview extension. I think the story from what we heard from you last time is that this is an emerging spine of the district, certainly within the first phase. And given the width of this right of way and how it's positioned, this is one of the bigger departures from the Portland's planning framework, that we're seeing Broadview wanting to do more in terms of height, in terms of density, in terms of being a focus for retail and activation. That's one of the major departures from the Portland's planning framework that we're wanting to explore here. And we heard you loud and clear in that first round. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend too much time here. We heard a little bit about when we're coming back to this panel. We're still looking to report out by December of this year on phase 1. Next slide, please. And some of the quick recap from what we heard from the consensus comments on the first round. Generally speaking, this idea of leading with landscape, that's very common to waterfront projects across the city. We heard that should be a major defining factor. This idea of a bold vision and kind of a bold approach to character in the neighborhood is something that will come out further in detailed design, but we hear that that's a major factor in how we're thinking about the district and what makes it different from others. And finally, this idea of a clear rationale of where we're departing from previous planning work. Next slide, please. Some of the urban design pieces we're looking at is looking at consolidating access and consolidating and focusing some of the retail and activation happening. Again, pointing to a maybe more prominent role for the Broadview extension. Finally, on build form, this idea of flexible typologies and a distinct character, looking at places like King Spadina and how that can evolve in the fullness of time. And some of the idea of wrapped programs and conversion to other uses. So with that, I'll hand over to Julie for our last slide about questions for panel consideration.
So on the public realm, do you support the proposed design refinements to the district street network? For the district park, what do you believe are the critical factors to inform the preferred direction between the two options? And then on built form, does the variety of building types address the need to substantially increase residential density while maintaining livability in McCleary district? And finally, are the proposed base building massings appropriate for providing flexibility in land use and protecting for air quality, for a high quality public realm?
And with that, we can turn it over to the applicant. Consultant.
So there's one chair here. I can grab another one. Or is that? If you would like to seat it up here.
You can cycle it.
I'm going to take this one. Yeah.
There's some kind of
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. Paul Kulik from Perkins and Will. We're leading the land use planning component of the study, and you're going to be hearing from Frank and Stephen around public realm and built form, respectively. We've got a quick agenda there. I think the important part here is we've sort of teed up two options, and these are really meant as explorations where we've zeroed in on kind of a moment in time where we're sort of testing a couple approaches to both built form and public realm, but understanding this is a comprehensive district plan or precinct plan, and we're open to your feedback across the board on any other elements as they may come. So I'll take you through those to some very quick demonstration plans that present the two options, and then we'll hear more specifically about built form and public realm. Just going back to the vision as Colin and Julie described, we are looking to create sort of this idea of a nexus, and it's a place that exists sort of at the intersection of the other districts, and sets up a truly mixed use area, something that supports production, interactive, creative uses, but is also rooted in sort of landscape and the investments in the public realm that have happened along the Don Roadway, Villiers beyond. It also acts as a new bridge between the district park at McCleary and extends the idea of water, nature, green infrastructure throughout the precinct. It's rooted in a couple of principles. I won't go through these in detail. I think you've seen them before. They haven't evolved. There's been a little bit of wordsmithing, but I think we'll move quickly to some big moves, really starting again with the idea of building off of the landscape. And if you can imagine McCleary Park on your right, and the Don Roadway River on your left. The idea here is really that we are looking to build off of those investments in the public realm, weave the idea of the river delta that existed here historically into the precinct, and Brent will walk through how that's made manifest in the public realm. We're also looking to bridge across the two regional or district parks, and you'll start to see the evolution of the Villiers and the new east-west streets and their specific character and how that starts to provide that bridging function. Center to the park or to the district is a civic heart, and so we've started to map out some of the institutional uses, schools and other, and some of the retail approaches around that heart. And then also we've sort of spent a little bit more time looking more detail into the sort of transit infrastructure and understanding where those nodes of activity and how that translates perhaps into density and unique approaches to both the public realm and built form. And then at the end of the day, looking to create an area that does support that broad mix of production uses, so much more than the kind of basic mixed use you may see elsewhere. So just starting with a kind of character area assessment, Colin walked us through the sort of perimeter precinct, the perimeter edge conditions in the public realm that's unique to those, but I think there's also a unique land use condition with a very strong commercial area to the north and the kind of transit hub in the East Harbor, sort of the nature and the river features of Villiers, the film production to the south, and then actually a kind of long-term employment uses to the east that we sometimes forget about, but it is a kind of important piece that will continue, and we exist in between that. At the center of our precinct, we really see those two east-west streets as kind of core, and so those blocks, the park and those two east-west streets where we've got a two-sided condition is really where we can have the greatest impact and create a unique response to the context. So we see that as being quite distinct from both a public realm and built form perspective. And then we've got two edge conditions, one along Lakeshore in the north and Commissioners to the south that again respond to the unique sort of traffic, noise, public realm, land use, and conditions to generate, again, unique built form and public realm responses. And then as Julie highlighted, the importance of Broadview extension as sort of an area that attracts activity, is supported by transit, and Stephen will walk through some of the evolution of built form that we're showing there, some of the changes in how that's worked, and how that could support those productive uses perhaps. Julie talked a bit about fixed elements. One thing we've got is the sort of height envelope, and just walk through this the last meeting in the PLPF. We are consistent with the height peak at the Lakeshore Don Roadway intersection, although it's raised up in response to some of the conditions or the approved buildings to the north. So you've seen the East Harbor buildings considerably higher. We've sort of pulled our height up to effectively match. We're still tapering down as you go from west to east, and then tapering down more aggressively to the south. Although again, we've pulled up those edges along Commissioners in response to some of the pine woods approval. So these are on the south side of Commissioners. We think there's some opportunity for density there. And then we've also pulled up the edge along the Broadview corner in the southeast, specifically acknowledging the kind of importance of that transit node as an activity node, and potentially with some land use implications. The second thing we've done is we've identified some protections around parks. And what you've seen here, if you just sort of pay attention to the edge, we've carved out a cone into that envelope. And this is sort of an area of protection for sunlight to the parks. It's not meant to be absolute, but it's an approach we've taken on things like the Lower Young Precinct Plan and then elements the city has done through the TO core studies. We haven't put any hard hour limits or restrictions to that, but it is the idea being that we will taper or adjust the built form to protect for some of those solar access to that park. Similarly, we're doing a little bit of tapering on the top of Bank, so towards the Dawn roadway. That was something that came out of the PLPF as a requirement. And so you'll see there is some tapering of heights to that edge. And so that starts to create this sort of envelope within which we can play. Another thing we've done, Julie's talked about the views. So the blue views are directly from the PLPF. There's the main view down the Broadview extension towards the Hearn Stack, the view of McCleary Park, and then the view down Keating Channel. We have added the red views because we do feel that the view back towards the precinct from the downtown is equally important. And so that can start to shape perhaps some exceptions, places where we can peek out of that envelope and celebrate specific areas. The second red dot in the middle of the blocks responds to what we think is going to be a critical view around that sort of civic heart and the park. And Stephen and both Brent will talk about how that is exhibited in the built form. So just to summarize briefly, the two explorations we're looking at is primarily park location and building types. The park location shown here is from the PLPF in the central block. We've tested a number of variations moving that to the western edge. And Brent has also explored opportunities to expand that park by taking away bits of the right-of-ways adjacent to really start to maximize that park as well as the adjacent green space. On the building types side, the PLPF was very restrictive. It had a kind of simple courtyard mid-rise condition with very limited towers and then the 40-meter tower separation, resulting in sort of the building type you see there. We've introduced a number of alternative building types. And so we've got some of what we're calling, let's say, fact towers, things that start to taper and maybe broaden those bases where appropriate. And then also tall mid-rise. So things that maybe push beyond a kind of classic mid-rise, look to the inspiration of like a Spadina warehouse, for example, and start to maybe support the PIC uses in a very kind of specific way. And so Stephen's going to walk through the mix of those. So the bit of a version of what Julie just showed you, streets and blocks, public realm, the height strategy. And the important part here is between the two options, the yield is almost identical. So there's almost no difference in total density, but you can start to see how the character of the public spaces and the building types varies. And that's where we're focusing the exploration. So very briefly, option one is the central park from the PLPF with some significant expansions, additions of a schoolyard, and a built form that is more of the podium and tower configuration consistent with the PLPF. And then the second one is where we test a Western Park expansion or a Western Park location together with those expansions, and then a much broader range of building types. And I'm just going to stop here and leave some time maybe for Brent to walk through the balance.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. So in 15 minutes, I'll take you through the public realm work today. Beginning with our approach, it's really in three parts. We start with ecology, where we're designing with and for nature and making space for Indigenous approaches to the public realm. The second part is culture, where we're wanting to promote a rich public life and deliver this high quality and healthy city. And lastly, movement, safe, varied, and inclusive experience for all users, no matter how you choose to move about the precinct. Now, where we depart in the public realm from the planning framework to the precinct plan is in several points. We've advanced the opportunities for placekeeping and placemaking. We've increased the amount of parkland and the opportunities for privately owned public spaces. The local park is now increased to become a district park, and there's a functional difference between the two. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Improved pedestrian porosity, more complete and greener streets, and then lastly, a refined retail and animation strategy. We won't present this. This was part of the appendices that was included as part of your package. The framework will start in phase one from the planning framework itself. There were 9 blocks, and each of these blocks you see here. Within the precinct plan, what we've done is consolidated the central blocks and taken away part of the public street to create the civic block. We've also narrowed a number of the rights of way so that we are putting more space into the development sites. Now, the block size itself, what's interesting here is that many of the blocks in McCleary are similar to the original 10 blocks in the city of Toronto. So these are not massive blocks. When we look at what happens on most new development sites, we can go to the East Bayfront and see that a lot of these blocks, there's a single project that happens, a single building. So many of the blocks are similar in scale to what we find at Chorus or George Brown or the Waterfront Innovation Center. These don't have mid-block connections. It's when we get these larger sites, like we find at Aqua Luna, where we do have mid-block connections happening through that. The parks and open space system. We have the Dawn on the west, and McCleary on the east, and the Civic where we have 2 options. Now, what you'll see is that in the areas that we've dashed out is the location of possible development, and we'll walk through that in a moment. The new addition here is the inclusion of a plaza along Broadview. This is a difficult to develop site. Along that, because of access, because of the relationship to the different streets. So at this point, we're suggesting that it's a really wonderful opportunity for an additional open space. Now, the connections, opportunities for mid-block connections on many of these blocks. What you see in the red is one that we are definitely firm on. This is a large site, and where we've located that connection separates a private from a public parcel. So it's really important to provide access within that much longer block. The others are more notional, but we're wanting porosity to happen on those blocks as well. As well, we've also increased the number of privately owned public space opportunities. These can happen at corners, they can happen in courtyards, they can happen mid-block. The boundary streets, which others have noted, Lakeshore, Broadview, Commissioners, and Don Roadway, are not part of this design work. So we're really focusing on the inner district streets. And what is the character of those? We have the blue-green street, which is connecting the Dawn to McCleary. We have the neighborhood street, which goes north-south, and then several of the Park Street characters. 2 of these Park Street characters on the north side, on the current Villiers Street, have the opportunity to be flexible. So closing, time of day, time of year, for special events, and really having a stronger connection to the park. Frontages, we're really wanting to make sure that we are retaining primary frontage for retail and animation along most of the streets and limiting access off some of these major streets. So we're not interrupting the pedestrian and cycling activities along those. And then what we end up with, because of the arrangement of open space and blocks, is that we have a lot of development that has a frontage or an address onto an open space. The landscape character that we are recommending is really referencing a habitat analog, and let's say the River Echo. This land was at one time the wetlands or the marsh for the river. Water and urban wilderness should permeate throughout. And we'll think of the spaces and streets together. We're giving opportunities to embed Indigenous perspectives in the next level of design. So what have we learned from other projects that are happening within Toronto? The inclusion of natural elements, plant, stone, and water is something that we're doing right now with West 8 as part of the inner streets with Waterfront Toronto for Quayside. The use of stone and marking moments of interest. Other examples include the land acknowledgement at TMU, Indigenous cultural markers, public art, the sculpted glacial erratics as part of a park that we did up in North York, And then the planting scheme with trophic design as part of the Terry Fox Legacy Art Project. So there are many different ways that this plan can support that type of introduction in the next level of work. Now, the district park is the largest open space within the precinct. And as you can see from these images, it is meant to accommodate a certain program. The key factors that we considered were the size. A district park does require a minimum of 7,500 square meters. It needs to accommodate active recreation uses. We thought of the adjacencies and the views, noise and air quality, the microclimate and thermal comfort, the grading that was noted previously, the timing of implementation, and the Hydro 1 corridor that's along the Don roadway. Now, in our explorations, as Paul noted, we did look at a lot of different options here. What we're bringing forward are two. Now, in the PLPF, the local park did not meet the district area requirements. It was too small at 7,000 square meters, and we need 7,500. The first option is where we, within the civic block, locate the park, take over the right-of-way, and have this connected. So we're increasing it from 7,000 up to 9,300 square meters. So a fairly substantial increase on the park itself. We've also located a school with a schoolyard within the podium of a signature building. In this option, it's on the west side of the civic block. And the simple shift in the next option is to rotate that, where the park is on the west side and the school and the yard are on the east. Now, we've heard about the flood protection landform and the grading that comes from that. It's about a 4-meter grade difference from the inner part of the precinct up to the top of the Don roadway. And you'll see that it does impact both development and park along this side. Here are some sections going from the river into Salter Street, so about 2/3 of the way through phase 1, and just a blow up to show you how the flood protection landform works within the Don roadway. It is below grade, and the high point is 80.25. That is a static point that cannot change because of protecting the landform itself. Broadview Plaza, again, has a wonderful opportunity to create a new public space that wasn't contemplated as part of the planning framework. And just for a scale comparison, is very similar to the Cloud Gardens or Town Hall Square in Yorkville, or the Parliament Plaza, the east side, that we're currently doing with West 8 as part of the Quayside development along Parliament Street. Privately owned public spaces can take a lot of different forms, whether it's plazas, squares, rooftops on podiums overlooking the landscape, or even interior space. The Don roadway, noted before, has been before this Waterfront Toronto Design Review Panel at least 6 times previously, and establishing the river's edge to Civic Plaza design up to 30%. What's constructed out there now is a temporary landscape, but the intent is that in the fullness of time, that will get completed. The streets make up the last part of the public realm framework, where we're really wanting to set these up to support nature and public life. And what happened in the planning framework is it spoke to complete streets and green streets about advancing that visible water theme. The precinct plan, as Julie had noted, is about testing and confirming some different aspects of this, changing some of the street rights of way, making them having less carbon footprint, more efficient use of land, making them more urban. And how to develop options for the next practice of Toronto streets. I think this is a really important part because our thinking has evolved over the time that we've been working on the waterfront. Lessons learned from what we've been involved in as part of the East Bay Front, looking at Dockside Drive, which we designed about 15 years ago, constructed in 2012, and then Merchants Wharf, which is just outside this building as long as Edgewater Drive, which was done by others, leading edge of streets at the time. But we've turned a corner. We're thinking about streets differently. As part of the inner street design, which we've taken a 60% detailed design, we've tightened up the roadway. We slowed traffic down. Cars are now visitors to this public space. We've made the green infrastructure visible. We've created these opportunities to tell the stories of Indigenous culture within this landscape. So this is the jumping off point. The street network in McCleary, they're the major streets, the connectors and the inner streets. Many of these already have design or being constructed, and some of them still need to go through an EA process. We'll talk about the ones that are in red. The street rights of way, as I noted, we did reduce them substantially. Some are 20% reduction and others up to 33. The one that we haven't tweaked yet does need to go through the environmental assessment process. So the new east-west street that you see towards the bottom. Villiers is one of the existing streets within the precinct at 24 meters. Certainly not a lovely place and designed to support the land uses that once were there. The Port Lands planning framework suggested this type of street with a 3-lane section, protected cycling, but nothing really special about the public realm. We see this as an opportunity to start introducing what we call the park streets, where again, we reduce the amount of space that's given over to the storage of cars, introduce the opportunity for green infrastructure and visible stormwater. When we get adjacent to the park itself, these become the segments that are possible flexible areas. We create a bit of a horizontal shift and create a chicane so that these have the opportunity to be almost an extension of the park up to those development blocks. Salter Street is the other existing roadway, and it runs north-south 30 meters currently. Now, we're able through this process to reduce that to 20 meters. So a 10 meter reduction, which is substantial. The planning framework suggested this type of street. Again, nothing really significant about the quality of its public realm. But similar to the park streets, we take on a similar approach where we're reducing the amount of space for the storage of cars. We create opportunities for public life and green infrastructure to flourish. And lastly, we look at the east-west street. Knowing that this has to go to an environmental assessment, the conversation last time before this panel was, can this project inform what happens and is tested within that? And that's definitely something we can do. This is what was recommended as part of the planning framework. We're suggesting that we could really improve the opportunity for bioswales, which was one of the recommendations as part of the Portland's planning framework, including the protected cycling. And it's an asymmetrical street. So on the north side is where the stormwater feature is, and on the south side, there's still planting, but it's really balanced to the north. And another option we believe has merit is to really slow this down even further, make it about a 30K, 20K type of street so that we can really increase the amount of greening. It's slow, it's shared, and this could potentially be the greenest low carbon street that we have in the city. So that's it for the public realm. I'll pass it on to Steve, who can take you through the built form.
We're a little behind time, so we're 10 minutes.
So I won't belabor the original PLPF scheme other than to sort of show the slide, which illustrates, I think, pretty clearly the kind of jump in scale from the East Harbor development approved heights, but also the sort of intensity of the tall buildings, as well as the area to the south, the approved towers, just a hint of the Villiers Island, or I guess New Island to the west in the bottom left corner. And just to highlight the sort of contrast in scale and why we've essentially undertaken this exercise of intensification. I think everybody's probably well aware of the Villiers Island district plan being amended with approximately 60% more residential yield as of last month. And so that was really the new benchmark as we looked towards McCleary district in terms of the intensification target. Just as a reminder, McCleary district is intended to be the most intense and dense development area within the New Portland's zone. So to reiterate slightly what Brent was talking about, we're going to go through a set of diagrams here that show the built form through McCleary in a sort of sequence that sort of builds up from the PLPF. The original 12 block scheme, of course, didn't include for the schoolyard, as Brent mentioned. And so we've effectively had to lose or remove an area, buildable area from the scheme at the west side of McCleary, and that's represented by the blue color on this diagram here. But with the decreased right of ways for the streets, we've effectively enlarged the blocks forms on a number of the blocks within the precinct. And that's represented by gain built area by the red color. And you'll see in the sequence of slides to come that red sort of follows increased buildable area, blue, the removal of buildable area. Excuse me. I believe Paul mentioned the original vision of the PLPF was a sort of ring of residential podia with courtyard configurations, double loaded residential effectively. We saw that as very limited and that there was much more potential for development within the blocks than was sort of envisaged at that earlier stage. And so we've incorporated the core of the blocks as well within that development potential, and specifically looking at potential uses like the PIC use or potential parking structure within the blocks, because we know that the water table is very high in this area, obviously, so close to the lake. We don't anticipate more than one below grade parking level would be financially certainly attractive, maybe even feasible. So the expectation is that some of the developments may incorporate parking within that zone at mid-block to protect it from the street and not affect the public realm, but just to get the numbers to where potentially they might need to be from a sellability perspective. But also the potential accessory to PIC use, potentially large retail. Here we're talking about the sort of more urban forms of grocery stores, but also potentially big box stores providing construction materials and rental equipment for the set building needs of the film industry to the south and southeast. I've got just in the corner here a kind of excerpt of one of the private applications that was already looking towards doing just that with the Black Box Studio at the center of the development for one of the parcels, just as a demonstration of what that might look like. Going to the built form above the podium, obviously the tower distribution in the original PLPF put primacy on Lakeshore Boulevard, but also the Don Roadway on the west side, but really didn't address the center of the precinct. And as you've heard multiple times at this point, the Broadview extension now is more and more a kind of area of focus of intensification. So obviously the kind of nature of the taller buildings and the distribution through the built form and in the precinct follows that. And so we feel it's more than appropriate to add taller buildings within that zone, again, colored in the red color, while maintaining the 40-meter separation, which is part of the original vision, of course. We have a couple of examples here just of the built form again and the sort of density and how they compare in terms of the distribution of Villiers Island and East Harbor, as well as the now completed built example at Canary, or Maple House at Canary Landing in the nearby distillery district as what that might look like. We feel the additional towers certainly don't compromise the vision for a sunny, comfortable, inviting public realm. And I want to highlight that none of the changes that we've been studying and proposing with the set of diagrams and ultimately the demonstration schemes are compromising on that fact. You've seen a couple of times the sort of height map with the height peak for the district proposed to be at the northwest corner at Lakeshore and Don Roadway. We've got some prominent views. Paul noted some of the additional red arrows in its diagram of critical views. Add to that the view down the DVP will be very prominent to this tower at the northwest corner. So again, it's really the sort of front door in some respects to this whole development, and see the kind of potential for a landmark tower very clear at that corner, potentially even higher than the East Harbor development, but right now we're proposing to match that. And then the sort of shedding of height towards the east and towards the south, a little bit more prominently to the south as we transition to the lower height film district development. And trying to make for a little bit of variety in that transition, not a kind of strict tent pole kind of single line or vector downward, but allowing for variety and a little bit of visual interest to be introduced in that kind of diminishing height. Just a diagram cutting through here at the looking to the east and north-south section, just to kind of further illustrate that point. We have along Lakeshore, where certainly the clearest mandate for height and intensification and density exists. So adjacent to the East Harbor development, we also see the potential for the kind of increased floor plate dimensions, getting these towers even up and above the kind of 850 square meter. It's not a line in the sand, but it's sort of informal limit that's more kind of common within Toronto. Here we're proposing up to about 30 stories for the kind of floor plates to exceed 850 square meters. And we're proposing that in a sort of careful manner that sort of works with the kind of core to window dimensions to maintain a reasonably short one, with the intent being that development within this district respects best practices as far as bedrooms. We're not trying to promote the kind of introduction of inboard bedrooms with borrowed light. We want every bedroom in this district ideally to be having direct access to daylighting. And so in the appendix materials, we've gone a little bit farther into developing the floor plate and explaining why we've got the tower distribution and shape that we've got with a north-south oriented floor plate with a kind of, I wouldn't say a hard limit, but a kind of structured limit of about 22 meters wide for the short direction. And with that dimension more or less fixed in terms of our kind of vision here, we are able to step further in the long direction and add units without compromising those quality of the units. And we're using the affordable rental housing framework from 2015 by the City of Toronto to inform both our unit count estimates for this district, but also in terms of targeting the same values. The shadow study in the top right here, really we're calibrating the heights both of the towers and podia to avoid impacting the multi-use trail that was spoken of earlier as part of the kind of periphery of the precinct. This was one of the kind of critical considerations in the PLPF originally, and we've managed to maintain that. There are a little bit more shadow added to the multi-use trail, but they are sweeping shadows consistent with the tower locations. And so the kind of impact of those shadowing is a more transient one, and more or less it's in full sun with momentary shadows. At the bottom left, just a quick street view illustrating the kind of street wall effect of having that variety, both of the kind of height peaks of towers, but also these lower level tower extensions to the north. We see how they might inform the street wall to give a little bit more variety to what could be a quite interesting wide boulevard experience, and how that contrasts on the left within the same view to the East Harbor development with a much more, I'll call it restrictive series of heights and forms. Switching to the podia for a sec, we have looked at the PLPF pretty carefully. The kind of height peak for the podium in the PLPF at the northwest corner was 8 stories, but largely the podium heights throughout the district were 6 stories or down to 4 stories.
You want me to put it up in the boardroom maybe?
He needs to mute.
It's not for me, right? We've looked at back at the tall building guidelines, design guidelines from the City of Toronto, and we've explored going to their maximum advised heights, which is 7 stories or 24 meters in height. And that's something we've applied throughout the district as a sort of baseline condition. We feel obviously that with the diminished right of ways on the interior streets, we've got some pretty tough conditions for developing, intensifying development. But we feel we can match the kind of recommendations of the tall building guidelines with the sort of hard cap to create the street wall. Where we've got larger right-of-ways at those main streets, we're able to go higher, of course, and we're proposing to do so up to about 10 stories or even 12 with setbacks. Again, respecting the shadow impact on the multi-use trail to the north at Lakeshore and some of the top of bank along the Don River considerations, as well as the main parks within the district. The cost of doing that with an 18-meter right of way, of course, if we're up at 24 meters tall, we're well in exceedance of the recommendation for the height of building face to right of way ratio, which was a 0.8 target in this case. And so what we're proposing to do is make for a kind of inequitable division of heights within the street wall on these east-west streets. We're proposing to refine the north edges of the blocks where they align with these east-west pedestrian first streets to reduce the heights at the street wall considerably. And that's done in a calculated manner to allow for sun angles to reach the sidewalk, the curb on the north side of the street, but also to penetrate through and allow for landscaping and plant growth. And specifically to ensure that there's potential for a second row of trees on the south sides of the streets. So it's really a kind of combined effort with the urban realm on that front. And of course, that does come at the cost of reduced buildable area, plus the blue color. You can see on the one street to the west here, I guess, the kind of similar condition that exists at Merchants Wharf, where we've got a street wall on, in this case, the east side that's about 10 stories high, but a much more varied and kind of heterogeneous condition on the west side of the street, and how one sort of supports the other to allow for a kind of greater intensification. But if we blend the two heights in the proposed street sections that we've been working up in our scheme, we come close to achieving an average of about that 0.8 ratio. And then at the bottom right, can't see quite the image, but you can see again the sort of shortened street wall on the shadowed side, the south side of the street or north side of the built form, and how that might interact with the kind of sun-washed south-facing taller section to the.
Sorry, Stephen, just 2 more minutes.
That's one of the east-west streets.
Very quickly, looking at the sort of plaza at Broadview, it's already been spoken about a little bit, the phase 1 and phase 2 distribution and the sort of awkward residual plots of land that the diagonal of Broadview has created. So making lemonade out of lemons in some respects, we feel that eliminating those built areas, those development parcels as a sort of first step solves that problem by giving back to the civic realm or public realm, the civic space, a kind of unique character within this precinct and potentially within all of the Portlands. And so again, removing the built form with the blue color, also removing a small bit of the podia where the critical sight lines out to the stack of the transfer station exists, allows for the maintenance of those critical views. Very quickly, just looking at the kind of intensified broad view now with our kind of attention there instead of at the Don roadway, we have an opportunity by removing those awkward, challenging to develop sites by really looking at an enlarged effective street wall to street wall width, where we go from 37.5 meters at the north, where the standard Broadview right-of-way distance exists, and into those middle blocks and southern blocks, we can expand out to about 85 meters. And what that does for us in terms of making for a significant civic space, but also allowing for the expressions of height to be much more harmonious with the public realm at the street. Overall, we're at about 2/3 additional residential yield over the PLPF. And I guess the kind of two primary schemes that we've got here, we've colored 5 towers in pink. The middle 2 towers we're proposing to be removed in the alternate scheme at this point. And what that would do is effectively be replaced, that area would be effectively replaced by a tall mid-rise condition, laying those 2 towers effectively on their sides to promote for a more even street wall condition down that flaring Broadview Street corridor now, to really kind of create a kind of sense of containment within that zone, which offers a kind of series of benefits, as we've been able to illustrate with some of the views in the appendix. I won't spend much time on the actual two schemes. We have noted up the heights that are here, as well as coloring red the differences between the two schemes. Other than to say that, this is a snapshot in time. Some of the heights are still in play, of course, and this represents current thinking, but the conversation is fluid and ongoing. And so really the contrast between the two forms is what we want to stress at this point for kind of directing your attention and inquisition towards. I will just very quickly touch on the precedent, the south of Queen Street experience, traveling south on University towards the Shangri-La, which is almost axial on that vista, and how it doesn't compromise the views to the surrounding architecture, because one potential concern would be if we flare open the broad view to create that plaza district, are we compromising or taking away from that critical view to the Hearn? My feeling is that we're not, but we want to make sure that that's well tested as an assumption. A couple of civic spaces lined by tall mid-rise that are approaching the same area in terms of footprint and also the geometry. Don't need to belabor that. And then just a final comment on that tall mid-rise scheme. We've got a series of precedents from recent days that have been built in Toronto with, I'll call them fairly sheer frontages, where essentially they're built out to the property line on the street side with relatively little differentiation. What we've noted here, A, B, C, and D all being fairly close together at Bathurst and King area. These buildings have quite the presence, and right now they stand fairly isolated or alone within a much lower context, but trying to imagine how further infill at the same scale might look and create in terms of the street experience when we're talking about 24-meter or 30-meter wide streets. I think there is some level of concern how that might further develop as that infill condition perpetuates. And at the bottom right corner here at 370 Queens Quay West, we have maybe the first experiment on that same kind of infill condition, with the two towers now being joined by a third tower, all at 21 stories high. This location being wide open to the south and to the lake views. So of course there is no kind of built form opposite the building at Tower 3. But the scale is, in my view, starting to really exceed the pedestrian comfort level. And contrasting that to the kind of expression of those podia up to about 6, 7, 8 stories high, when treated similar to a tower and podium form with the tall mid-rise via setbacks, but also material expressions. How do we control, or is it appropriate to even try to control at the level of a district plan the development of tall mid-rise? And what happens if we can't?
We're going to have to end it. We're way behind here.
Okay, very quickly, park options. I think you've had a chance to read through them. There's very little in the way of the two park options in terms of the impact to built form. So I'll just go straight to the bottom line. Overall, the central park option may be slightly worse from a built form perspective specifically, but it's not a major determining factor.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. A lot of material there. We're going to go to questions first, and then we'll do comments after. And I actually have one question that I would like to just put on first. And when we were here at our March meeting, I know we had a lot of discussion about how we want to make sure this plan was unique, not more of the same, not more of a typical kind of City of Toronto experience. And the key question, though, and I reread the minutes on this, is we asked him, what's the big idea? And I would love to hear from someone succinctly, in your own words, what's the big idea behind this plan? Because that was a key point of discussion that we had.
So
I can make reference to, I know there's a lot of discussion about the unique opportunity where the Dawn, empties into the harbor and the lake, and the special nature of that, et cetera, et cetera. And that was all, in the minutes. So That's where I'm coming from.
So I'm happy for Colin to comment on this too, because there's a lot, Paul, it's fixed and static. So we're working within a framework that has been established around ownership, utilities, and all of the adjacencies. Perhaps subtle, the big idea is how we make the river come into effectively so that sense, that landscape character and how it informs the quality of the public. It's a big ask to increase the residential benefit here. So how do we make the most of the public spaces that we have to really reinforce them? And I would say that, in my opinion, is really the big idea, even though subtle. It's how do we treat public space? And the opportunities for making big moves, shifting blocks, changing ownership, all those things, somewhat limited. But I will say that we've had these conversations with the city. How do you write a precinct plan so that there's still flexibility? And we know that precinct plan set out basic framework. We've seen it here and where we are right now. What's on the ground today at the East Bayfront is not exactly as was planned for in 2003 when that precinct plan was done. And certainly the West Donlands has evolved over its time in building out. So what we want to do is get the ingredients right. And there's certainly opportunities for evolution and change on the public blocks as those.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I just wanted to ask that outright. I'm going to first go to Pat Hansen, who's online because she has a time constraint. Pat, are you there? You said she had to leave at 4:30. Yeah. Are you there, Pat?
Now you can hear me. It's a question. Do we ever, I'm just trying to think, do design guidelines after we do the precinct plans? Like, do we follow up this question to Chris with more precise development guidelines?
Well, I think we have at Waterfront Toronto in some of the precincts.
Right.
I'm not sure what the next steps are that are intended for this one. Waterfront Toronto is not leading this one, so.
Right. I'm just thinking about that issue around the, high mid-rise. I mean, that could probably be accommodated somehow by, built form, like by more prescriptive guidelines. I'm just wondering that when you're kind of dealing with this kind of density and alternate kind of planning strategies, that if the planning needs to go a little bit further than at this level. Anyway, that's all.
Okay. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Pat, it's Paul Kulik here. The scope in our study does not include urban design guidelines, but it will include a sort of a preliminary zoning bylaw. So there will be some opportunity to quantify, provide some restrictions and context specific, let's call it built form direction around what a tall mid-rise looks like and how that's distinct from the typical avenue mid-rise guidelines.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Go back to the panel. Bridget, questions?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to clarify, do you have an Indigenous consultant or have you consulted with a group of Indigenous groups? I just was trying to understand from your presentation.
I can answer that. We don't, but we've been consulting, the Portland's team and the Waterfront Secretariat has been consulting with First Nations, but the McCleary District group doesn't have an Indigenous consultant. So yeah, we're kind of under the umbrella of the Portland's work.
And then I appreciate, first of all, I thought it was, interesting presentation and multi-layered. And I guess just in response to Paul's kind of bigger question about what the big idea is, I guess I heard that you were leading by landscape, but I didn't see the actual McCleary Park on the east side, which I understood was actually part of your area. So you actually showed all these other things, showed broad view coming down, but then the park was actually not in, it showed up in maybe the one or two context plans at the beginning, at the end, but when you were showing like the big, like the park in different configurations, you actually never showed McCleary Park. which is kind of like one of the key open spaces. It also goes from Lakeshore all the way to Commissioners with a few pieces of industrial infrastructure sitting in the park. Is there a reason for that?
Plan addresses phase one. It's
The
the western
western
part
half.
of the next phase of the precinct.
So that's not part of your scope.
That's
So I'm sorry, I didn't understand that from even the way it was presented at the beginning, I didn't understand. So is that part of somebody else's scope? Like, is that like so this is only phase one, and at some point someone's gonna do phase two, but it may or may not be you guys? Or,
No, sorry, maybe I can just weigh in on that because it's relevant to the phasing that I mentioned at the top. A big question with respect to existing McCleary Park is the exact future road alignment related to Broadview and Bouchette. We haven't been able to get into it here, but one of the contemplated changes in the planning framework is that with the extension of Broadview south of Lakeshore, it would actually necessitate the shift of Bouchette over, and thus would change the dimensions of existing McCleary Park. So the EA work on that has to advance further before we can say with any certainty what that potential impact might be. So it would be premature for us to undertake any design work without knowing what those constraints will be. Our full expectation is once that EA work has advanced, we would then come back with the same, I would hope with the same team, but certainly with the same leadership on this to advance that future work.
okay, and while this image is up, I just want to clarify, just so I understand, which are the private lots, parcels within, so you're saying most of the things on the west side are actually publicly owned, and Create TO is actually the guiding force for that. But maybe could you just tell me which ones are private and not in your control, but maybe subject to the overall guidelines, just so I.
So Julie or Colin, maybe somebody could just point out where Salter is on this diagram, or Paul can do that.
Right.
And then everything to the west of that is Cratio owned. And then there's a little bit of complexity. I mean, Paul, you can probably just identify in the blocks there, which are private and public.
1, 2, 3 are private blocks that have active development applications that I think will be in front of the panel in a month's time.
Okay.
And I believe some of these may be private as well.
So this is public, that's public, that's public. Yeah, so.
So that. Okay.
Mostly front.
Yeah, so the issue of the future of Broadview is sort of not really in your control because they're private developments, but you want this public connection from the city all the way through to the commissioners, right? It's a pretty important link to make sure it's not like an isolated island. And Broadview is kind of critical because it goes all the way, it goes way north, it's Danforth further north, like it's a kind of important north-south street. So okay, so these are just questions, like we're in question and just trying to.
Questions,
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you so
I
much.
gotta try and go around.
Can I just respond quickly to say that the angle of Broadview as it goes from McCleary hasn't had an environmental assessment yet, but north of Lakeshore through East Harbor, it has. So that alignment's been established to Lakeshore, and the intent is an EA will continue.
And then for you, for you, in terms of the alignment and the angling, you're really using the Hearn as a kind of anchoring point and the stack as a kind of a key marker in that.
That was the planning framework that established that axis.
Okay, great. Thank you
right.
very much.
I'm gonna go back to online. Betsy, are you there?
I'm here and I have no questions, but I'd like to do my comments earlier rather than later, if
Okay,
possible, in the next round. Thank you.
Yeah, what time is your
I'm good as long as you circle around to me on the early side of comments.
No
Thank you
problem.
so much,
Thank you
Paul.
very much. Okay, so let's go back to the panel. Tina?
So my questions are more around, you mentioned that there are some fixed sort of non-negotiable aspects of the grid specifically. And I read the minutes. I was not here actually in the meeting in March. So is it, you mentioned that they're the main streets, and does that include the new east-west street? So could you just refer to which are the newly imposed streets that seem to be reinforce the grid? But like, what is non-negotiable?
So Broadview, which is on the angle, that's the eastern boundary of the work that we're doing. That needs to go through an environmental assessment. Commissioners, which is on the south, that's its current alignment. That also needs to go through an assessment. Lakeshore, and then the Dawn roadway. So those are the boundary streets. Villiers, which is the street just south, it's the east-west street south of Lakeshore. That is an existing street that actually continues over in Villiers Island. So right now it goes from Cherry, or it did before the river, Cherry all the way to Salter Street. That is in its current alignment as well, making use of it. It's also in between two private parcels, the two private parcels. The new east-west street is aligned so that when the intent of the planning framework, the Portland's planning framework, is that it will extend through the transfer station as a new major street, which isn't shown here, but it's oriented in a way that'll go between the stack and this building through the park. That requires future study. The only other additional street is this new north-south street. Now, that is one of those streets that could shift east or west in its arrangement, but that is something that would require further study. It does exist within the publicly owned lands by the city and under the control of Creatia.
Okay.
I'll add, Salter and Villiers also have a whole long list of utilities that are existing that can't be moved easily. And the new east-west street has planned utilities, so we can't get rid of it. At the very minimum, we need a utility corridor because it's doing the storm drainage for the entire East Harbor neighborhood. So it can adjust, but there needs to be at the minimum some right of way.
Right, and in that regard, the wiggles that you presented in your presentation, they're not really shown as inflections in the grid, but because the scale is quite small, or is what we're seeing in the plan in terms of just the general width, assuming that there is space for that, or would it inflect? For example, the relentless like a wall of podium, would that get inflected based on
the way is straight? What happens in between buildings is what shifts. So that is one way of creating some complexity in the public realm without changing the right of way itself.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to back to online. Gina, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I am. Thanks for
any
the
questions?
Just a brief one. Could you just say a little bit about the people that will be here? I think there was some note about it being an inclusive community with a mix of unit types for different size families and affordability, but I just curious, especially thinking about the public space and culture as one of the three tenets of the public space design, kind of how do you think about culture and the people here? Could you tell us more about that?
I can speak to that. So within the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan and all the Portland specific policies, there's a fairly significant housing section that talks about different unit types, about inclusive communities, and so that's already what we're working from as a baseline. But as it relates to culture, I think, and this goes back to Paul's question earlier about the big idea. The other part of the big idea here and what makes this area distinct is the fact that it's to be a productions interactive and creative supportive area to all the film and other productions, laboratory, institutional clusters around here. So it's the use mix that makes this place special is one of the big ideas here. So that's that 25% right now per block requirement, which is a fairly aggressive requirement for those kind of Productions interactive uses. We're looking on how to refine that, knowing that there's that existing cluster along Commissioner Street. So how that's deployed is something that we're considering. But in terms of what this area means for culture, if that component for working, and we know there's a lot of interest from that sector around workforce housing as well. So these are, that I think is the picture of the people we expect to see here.
Okay, thanks. Can I, sorry, a little bit of a departure. Pat, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. Yes, but I kind of have to go actually.
Yeah,
So you know what? Yeah,
Right, so
I
if
will
you want
follow up. I will
comments?
follow up. I'll follow up with email by comments. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, back to the panel. Fatty.
Just a quick clarification question. So everything east of Broadview is in phase one towards the park?
Effectively.
So basically the park, the 3 blocks, that's kind of
West of Broad.
East of
East of Broadview.
Phase 2.
It's phase 2, right? So what we're seeing here is just schematic. So there's nothing within the scope that looks at the frontage along the park, right? So
This is maybe a clearer diagram. We shown in gray the phase 2 exclusive blocks here.
okay, so the extension of things like the east-west, Blue Street, Blue Green Street, all of that is just adjusted for now, right?
Yes, I think it's safe to assume though,
Just-
that.
No solid. And one other really quick question, is there any information that we have on the soil conditions here, on the grading, water table, the kind of environmental substrate that we're working with, and how that then affects the placement of things like the parks, the streets, foundations? Knowing that this is a fill and pollute site, what's the existing condition of the terrain?
Yes, so there's a civil engineer as part of the team, not part of this presentation, but we have had conversations about soil permeability. Obviously, given a lot of the marsh or the amount of the dawn, high water table, but it is sufficiently below the surface that we are confident that we can introduce the active stormwater features, the open channel and the bioswale within this territory.
Okay. All right, Emily, questions?
Yeah, I have one quick question about the blue-green distinction of the new east-west. And the way that the other streets are described, it sounds like there's also like bioswales, and if I'm understanding it correctly. So why specifically are you calling that one out blue-green when the other streets are also blue-green?
So the Portland's planning framework specifically noted that new east-west street is having a particular type of green infrastructure element of an open channel. And that was part of telling the story of water and nature within the Portlands. But since that work was done, the city and work we've been doing is certainly advancing green infrastructure far beyond what was contemplated in 2017. So we see the opportunity to introduce more green, less hard on all of the streets. And certainly the east-west street has more opportunity because of its wider right-of-way. It's also the one street that has dedicated cycling facilities on it, which is why it's a wider dimension in the planning framework. So we're trying to stay true to the intent of the planning framework, but then also make the other streets greener as well.
Thank you.
Okay, David?
Just another question on the streets component. Are the 2 east-west streets required from a transportation perspective? Like, for example, could one of those streets be shut down to link or closed down to traffic to link park to park without vehicles on it at all? Or are they required for some reason to accommodate that?
So our understanding from transportation is that the closure of the one street to expand the park was all that we could do at this point. So from a transportation perspective, you are correct. And certainly with the intensity of growth at this point, David, that's the understanding.
And just a quick follow-up question on that one then. The cycling infrastructure for the neighborhood, is it only required on the streets surrounding the district? In some cases, we're replacing green infrastructure, it seemed in the options with cycling, like cycling comes out to accommodate green infrastructure. I just want to understand that trade-off. Is that the bottom line? Cycling on the outside, mixed on the inside?
So the new east-west street in the planning framework does have dedicated facilities on it. Commissioners has dedicated facilities, Lakeshore, Broadview, Don Roadway, all of those larger. And everything else, all the other streets, it was optional. Want to make safe cycling on every street. But there are two ways you can do that. One is dedicated facility where you have higher speeds and volumes of vehicular traffic, so people feel safer in choosing to bike, or you can slow everybody down. And that's the approach that we're taking, because that leads to tighter streets, greater placemaking opportunities. Think of any local neighborhood street that happens within Toronto. Narrow streets, kids biking on the street, you don't have dedicated bike lanes. So that's the type of approach that we were taking.
Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, absolutely. Could you go to slide 24 if that's possible? Just wanted to ask about the connections, or I think they're implied through block connections here. You've illustrated them as going kind of parallel.
Forward.
24 is back, I think. Oh, forward, yeah. Forward. Your numbers are not the same as mine. Go ahead. Rather. Sorry. There we go. For the connections. So I'm wondering if you've taken a look or did any studies about having these connections not run parallel with the other streets, but diagonal from corner to corner. You know, corner to park as well, and then out of the park makes it easier for people to get to places faster.
The only one that we are recommending is north-south is the one shown in red. The others are notional, just to suggest that a mid-block connection is desirable, but it doesn't have to be in that specific location.
Is there any ways of dictating that or controlling where those entrances and exits are, just to make them more usable? And I know if I'm walking in a parallel path, what's the point of walking through a building at that point in time?
That's a good point. Is bringing people to the park is what we were showing here, but in the planning framework, they do show them as east-west, just through the central block.
Right.
The blocks along the north and the south don't have any mid-block connections or privately owned public spaces identified. But certainly it's notional, they could easily go east-west. So I think the way we would write the precinct plan is we want a mid-block connection. But yes, it's a good point.
Okay, Jana?
Yeah, just two quick questions. The first is I think you talked about it, but I must have missed it. What's the purpose of the cone? The cone? You had a slide on page 8 with the cone.
The typical approach City of Toronto takes for protection of solar access on downtown parks, so if you've looked at the Teal Court secondary plan, is no net new shadow from, I think it's 9:15 to 4:15, so it's 4 hours. There's 5 or 6 hours, and so what we've modeled there is effectively the void in the envelope that you're removing to protect that amount of sunlight. No, we're not saying that that's exactly what we're going to do, but just notionally, if we were to protect that, then Stephen then would take his heights and he's adjusting them underneath that envelope.
So in that slide at the end that shows all the massing, is there a reflection of that cone?
Yeah, so you'll see the buildings, the towers to the south of the park are typically shorter. They're 20 stories or lower, and then obviously the ones to the north are taller. As we move the park to the western option, there's less impact because that cone does bias into the afternoon hours towards the west. So the heights shown in the build form are all underneath that envelope. I'm not saying that that's an absolute rule, and maybe there are some exceptions if there's a landmark or a dedicated something. I think we can talk about the trade-offs of, an hour or two of shade on a park at the right location, but it's a starting point.
I think
Okay.
there's some, in the appendices to the document, there's some information that speaks to sort of daylight hours and corresponds with the massing. I think it helps give clarity to the idea of with respect to how the towers and the perimeter are masked and what the resulting impact is within the park itself.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is, I believe you said that the way that you were able to claw back more additional GFA was through infilling where you reduced the overall widths of the roadways. Is that correct?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, no more questions of anyone, I believe, so
I
we'll go
have
to,
I have one question.
oh, I'm sorry, who's that?
Stephanie Hardis from BA Group. So.
Oh, sorry, this is questions from the panel only.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I didn't think you were on the panel. Okay, so we'll go to comments. Bridget, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the presentation. A lot of information and very sort of, a lot of moving parts. And I just appreciate sort of the amount of layers. I guess one of the issues with all of our sites in Waterfront Toronto is that all these studies have limits and boundaries. It's just the way they're given out. But for the public, you're totally not aware of what the line between phase 1, phase 2 is. So this kind of issue of maybe presenting maybe the more aspirational dimensions, knowing that you have a dotted line and then somebody else has a dotted line, kind of would help from my perspective to have a bigger context for what the bigger idea is. First of all, I just think you need an Indigenous consultant early on in the team. If you have it too late, it's just really gratuitous and isn't really part of shaping the thinking process of the whole site. And I really like the idea that you're kind of opening up the water and you're kind of making a link there, which sort of gives you, to have the park facing the river and touching the river so that it actually is an elevation on the river as opposed to a small, tiny built form block, kind of almost plugging that just doesn't make sense. If your bigger aspiration is to have that connection to water, you kind of need that almost frontage to have that connection, right? And then everything flows from that. And I just feel like if that's what you want, I guess I feel like that's the massing of park to built form that's going to give you the kind of uniqueness and specificity to this area. I then feel like the east-west streets, Villiers, whatever your new east-west street, and how, for me, the fact that it goes all the way to McCleary Park, it actually it takes the tower, it uses the pieces of existing infrastructure, and you're between the park and those other Salter Street pieces, like that's really key. And it's so important to almost define that, even if it's not your kind of dotted line territory, because that's linking across in the east-west direction in a really powerful way that's not relying on commissioners or Lakeshore, but internal to the neighborhood. And that's about creating the character and specificity of the neighborhood that is so critical. Then I think, again, as I said before, Broadview is such an important connector. All the environmental assessment, there's a whole process, but how you design a really vital retail street that kind of cuts through, but also ties together public land, private land. In the end, the average citizen doesn't know who owns what. It's really about the vitality of Broadview that is really key. The little angle pieces having different kinds of setbacks. I think those are all part of making a public realm that makes Broadview specific and has a character to it that is distinctly different than the two east-west streets that you're talking about. So you want to you want to begin by saying we want a great retail street that is both a kind of linking and it's both in the neighborhood, but it links this neighborhood all the way back to kind of the end of Broadview ends up at O'Connor, right? Like that, it's like a really important north-south spine in the city. And I just feel like that to see the scale of Broadview and how it terminates here and then extends maybe across the shipping channel. That's another study by somebody else. But just that you're setting up a critical piece of Broadview that I just feel is so important. then when you had a couple of little small sections, I guess I feel like you're so close to Pinewood and the other film areas. And so what I understand from kind of listening to the whole thing is that there's a huge potential in a kind of mid-block condition that normally could be a courtyard, maybe it's parking, but in this particular neighborhood, there's a potential for flexible spaces that supports all of the picked uses. And what that is, how you design it, is kind of maybe the interesting new typology that is actually this district, because you're literally like Pinewood's like down the street, right? Like, and so you can imagine different kinds of small film facilities or ancillary conditions that could happen here just because of the physical proximity that's going to make this area unique and specific. And I think about the Crow's Nest Theater, the one up at Dundas, where in the middle of the block is a multi-flexible theater that it could have just been a dark space in the middle, but it's actually a small cultural space that is in a kind of East End neighborhood where there's no theater. So in a way, it's a kind of small example, but the fact that you're really working to create a new typology that has the potential for both small cultural facilities and production facilities that would not otherwise be like a dead space in the middle, but you would get like big floor plates, you get flexibility, you're only 2 or 3 floors up from the street, and it can truly support, you know, the Pinewood and everything on the south side of Commissioner. So it's kind of, for me, a unique condition of proximity and the kind of the area that, in addition to retail and having a park and having residential, is kind of like could actually be a driver that creates this new typology that kind of only happens here for a certain set of conditions. And I guess I would feel that understanding the specificity of the location that you're in and using that to kind of figure out, you know, access to blocks. You know, we have a whole thing where you want to share as much access points. You don't have too many garages. Like there's just a whole set of lessons from a lot of these built blocks that you could take and use it to make a better neighborhood. And especially at this early stage, build a new typology that I think would be really valued and make a big contribution to the city. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that layered presentation. I appreciate how much information you needed to get across, and I thought that it was very clear. I would say, you know, I totally concur and am excited about the way that Bridget is describing some of these inner block spaces and the sort of opportunity to expand or connect to the surrounding blocks and their function in these kind of creative maker spaces and performance spaces. I would caution, though, against that being a kind of unanimous condition, and I think that it isn't unique anymore if it's like in every single block, but mostly I think that these mid-block connections that we're seeing and even the faded gray dots have to be not an afterthought, much more deliberate and much more drivers of the built form, especially of these of the podium blocks, these 7-story, you know, somewhat relentless podium blocks. There needs to be the through block connection is really important, especially with this landscape first strategy. They need to be generous. They especially with the 7-story podium, they need to be tested for how wide. Maybe they're not consistently wide, but there's swells or openings that allow for them to actually be spaces for pedestrians. And that pedestrian network, I mean, I think that the most productive idea that you presented is the bridge. Even though McCleary Park is not in your purview, even though like all of the boulevards, Lakeshore, especially Broadview and Commissioner Street are not in your purview, it is absolutely incumbent on you to make these connections. You make the connections not by intervening on Broadview, but by suggesting through a Largo, through some kind of reverberation of a connecting space across Broadview. I think that the crossing of Broadview especially, but also Commissioner Street down to the chorus and other those productive spaces, as well as above Lakeshore where there's a lot of the commercial block. Like you really need to, from inside out, design this not like a docked ocean liner, right? This is actually needs to be porous, not just within the blocks with through connections, but across these rivers of the wide boulevard streets. And I think that the retail rationale, it's interesting. Streets designed as a street, but really when you think of retail patterns, like we can't think of Broadview like we might think of Bloor Street at a time where people are, strolling, crossing diagonally across one side to the other. This is a real barrier. So the retail rationale, I think, needs to be a loop, right? So it's a loop on the west side of Broadview and a loop on the east side of Broadview, an implied loop. What happens to the loading, servicing, et cetera, relative to that kind of pedestrian retail or animated, sidewalk experience.
Okay, thank you, Fatty.
Betsy wants to jump
Oh,
in.
I'm sorry.
Hey, Paul, can I go?
Betsy,
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation. It was very complete and really smooth. What I
Yeah,
see is
speak
that the
up.
roads- Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That what I'm seeing is that the roads, buildings, and parks have kind of been developed in silos, and I don't see a strong relationship between them to create a public realm experience that's better than what is developing around the city. I expected to see from our last meeting smaller scale experiments that looked at massing streets and parks, like relationally, almost like pockets of potential. And you have definitely tweaked the Toronto development typology with a little bit better roads, a little bit better, towers and podiums. But I think you need a major disruptor to start to energize this design exploration. You can't be so polite with all these previous studies, reports, and considerations. I mean, you have a very long list of requirements for why this rectilinear grid and podium towers is exactly the right thing for you. You also can't leave the interest and vitality to the future development because we know what's going to happen. You're going to have another huge set of requirements, especially with the film studios being kind of on board with it, that will further restrict the potential of this new area. I think the presentation's really, it's fine, but it's not exciting. Like, it's not screaming, this is a great site with a new typology of building in a new area of the city. And it's not leaving me personally anything to get excited about. And I think that's what you have to find for the next go round. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Betsy. Fatty?
Thank you so much. I'm very excited also about how you attempted to evolve the original PLTF when it comes specifically to the street design and the increase of density. But there's just one very fundamental assumption that I'm still grappling with, which kind of came from my question, that absent a clear understanding and demonstration through maps, drawings, analysis, topographic and hydrological conditions, especially of an area that was once upon a time a marsh, it's difficult to be 100% confident that your choice of, for example, where the park should be situated is the right one. For example, I still have questions as to why the civic park is placed dead center, equidistant between Lakeshore and Commissioners. Is this really the best place for it to be from an environmental point of view? And then are all the blocks that are then mirrored equally on either side of this park going to perform the best when it comes to blue-green streets? If it is, I just want to see a demonstration as to why. I'm again all 100,000% all for blue-green street systems. But I just need to be confident of their capacity to perform not just hydrologically, but socially. And this is where that goes in relation to what I think Betsy just said, is then how do the streets, parks, and infrastructure connect to the public realm? The building programming and the massing. And then just one very last piece is I want to advocate for a kind of new network of public realm and circulation system through this mid-block connections and through the POPs that not just potentially complements this grid, but really reshapes a brand new public realm in a really much more exciting and compelling way. So a bit more integration of all three elements, but also more critically, I need to understand in such a precarious environment and an area that was once upon a marsh, the role of the public realm and the blue green systems has to be made front and center in a much clearer and more convincing way. Thank you.
Thank you. Gina, are you still there?
Hi, yes, I am. Hi, thank you. It was a lovely presentation, and I especially like the diagrams of the different moves and the big ideas. I think I'm just going to echo some of what others have already sort of intimated or said out loud. I think in thinking about your three-part framework for the public realm, which I thought was really lovely, ecology, culture, and mobility. I really think ecology and mobility show through in the work that you're doing. You're really thinking about how to increase green space and have performative function for that green space. I just didn't feel so much, and I think this work will get made more rich by consideration of culture, especially knowing you have a unique audience, as you answered earlier in the questions around the relationship to the film industry and those different users and the creative energy and the kinds of needs there. It just feels like the images, the precedents that were shown for the park could be kind of a public park anywhere. And it feels like that's a really exciting driver to think about. Similarly, it just feels like the work is really clear about how it's meant to look, like what it's meant to look like. The precedents all are about a kind of visual character, but not so much about program or activation or how it's meant to function or work. And so even just like where are the spill out zones on the streetscape that become great people places? What's the actual program of the park that's going to meet the needs of the community that you're talking about? You know, what distinguishes the streetscape, this kind of river echo? How do people occupy that as part of the streetscape experience? And then I think, you know, a lot of the images too, I would just caution with the precedents. A lot of them feel they're lovely. A lot of them feel like they're kind of catering to a similar audience. Just even like there's not a backless bench in any of the images. You know, I'm getting older, so I see that all the time. I'm like, I wouldn't be comfortable to linger there. There's just kind of a sameness, and I think there could be more diversity about how you think about even just the precedent images and the kind of like mood images that you're starting to establish. And last but not least, I would just say that the opportunity of that topography adjacent to the park is so rich. I think right now it's being treated just like diagrammatically, but I think that's a real opportunity to think about how that can be contributing also to the sense of identity and character of the park space. So big picture, I just say double down on culture and think deeply about who you're serving with this public space and how that might inform how you're thinking about its shape and its identity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Emily.
Thanks. It was a great presentation, very clear. And I don't want to reiterate what others have said, but I do. I'll take Gina's mention about topography as a as a jumping off point. Actually, I think that the option 2 is the strongest in terms of how it relates to the river and bringing that kind of bridge you're trying to propose here with the connection of the existing park. And so I think like the overall structure that you have based on that would make a lot of sense. But I also would encourage you to look more closely at the flood protection landform that's at that edge and what that connection really is, because the topographic relationship that you have in the sections are really telling in terms of that connection with the river, that you're actually, the way that you're showing the park being graded and the kind of scale of things in there that I'm not sure that you're going to get that connection that you're talking about, at least visually and spatially. So I think that coming back in the next iteration, it'd be really important to understand those larger spatial connections of what's happening with the river. Can you actually even see it? You are opening up for this view shed, but you might not even feel the presence of it. So, you know, it is a piece of infrastructure to be dealing with just as much as the other infrastructures and constraints and considerations that you're looking at for the rest of the the precinct. So I would encourage you to think about that and think about how you could potentially either have those connections or have implications of the connections based on water. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about it, but being able to really set that stage for people so that it has a specificity, I think, is important. So that to the points that have been said, that the broader strokes might be misinterpreted in a way that it looks like it could be just a kind of really easy design here, but it's actually quite challenging, I would say. But I think that it's a good one to try and make that connection, and that doing the Central Park piece would potentially make the this district feel too insular and not a part of the larger context.
Okay, David?
Yeah, just in support of what Emily was saying as well, I agree that park location and linking it to the river is really critical. But I'm thinking of Corktown Common when your firm worked on it, and the conundrum there of the park not visually connecting, or as you enter the park with the river beyond, and how do you design this park so that it feels like it's part of the river? Well, visually, obviously it can't be because of the flood protection landform. So I think that's a really good precedent for that. I'm also, as I mentioned, obviously the park to park connection is really critical on this plan. And I'm still struggling a little bit with how children, for example, would move from one park to the next on their bicycles or going to school if all of the streets are don't incorporate integrated cycling in some way, or thinking about how an 8-year-old would move through this neighborhood in a way that they'd feel safe. I agree the neighborhood street model is a good one, but my understanding here is that it's going to be, say, much busier than the neighborhood streets in Riverdale or those quiet neighborhoods that we know so well. So I think that's something to think about. I certainly support all of your ideas around the green infrastructure and the beautiful ideas about Villiers really transforming that placemaking perspective, but I think that movement is still a really critical one. And the other thing about the plan, I would say too, is that in some ways, I think the most interesting parts of it are the kind of idiosyncratic moments, the Broadview Plaza as it kind of peels away, and the kind of the opening up of the corners of both the east-west street and Villiers, the mid-block connections and some of the modeling that looked like it looked like it was creating some really interesting internal spaces, and there's lots of discussion about that. I'm kind of wondering how all that's codified to ensure that those kind of inflections and kind of interesting places aren't lost, through development. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, Matthew?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a great presentation. I wanted to echo Bridget's comment, not just that you should hire an Indigenous consultant, but the thoughts around mixed use typologies in the podium, and also with PINAs, the connections and what they look like. Not only what they look like and how they function, but the convenience of them. Those point connections between blocks, I believe, should go corner to corner, should link into parks. It should allow you to move in a quicker way across a neighborhood. That's the only way people are going to use them. So really important there. One of your guiding principles is about Indigenous worldviews and planning. And I would love for you to say what those are. And if you don't know what those are, to work through or with other Indigenous people to gather and really be clear about what you're doing. This is one of the first presentations where I've seen a fair amount of Indigenous inclusion in the presentation. So I thank you for that. I thank you for that on the introduction as well. I know that consultation is hard. It's extremely difficult. It's a relationship that you really need to continually work at. So I am encouraging you to continue that work. We are identity taxed right now. So there's a number of different ways that you can maybe do that. And it might be even working with Waterfront Toronto to think about how they as a larger group can do the work with you. There's so many sites that are being developed. So a ton of questions that are being asked. So are there ways that we can kind of streamline this work to gather information that's going to start to inform high-level Indigenous design guidelines that we can apply to all of our precincts? But for this one in particular, I really want you to focus on this idea about Indigenous worldviews in planning and what those mean specifically. I think if you can nail those down, they're going to start to inform some of these other pieces that my colleagues have been speaking about.
Okay, Shannon.
Thanks, and thanks for a really very comprehensive presentation. I agree with what my colleagues have said. And so with respect to the time, I'm just going to ask about comment about one thing, and it's really a request for the next presentation. I think you've done a lot of work trying to respond to the comments from the last time. But I think there's still a kind of gap you aspire to and what you've shown us with your design. So I would say when Gina talks about culture, ecology, and movement, those are all great. And I think that can be the big idea cumulatively for the district. But it seems with everything that you presented, you stopped short of the design speculation that is going to bake in those qualities into the plan. So whether it's the park to park relationship, mid-block connections, the relationship of the new podium to the experience of a pedestrian, the Broadview Plaza, you don't go beyond the obvious of like, well, we had to do this, so here it is in plan. And what we need to see is your speculative drawings and how that actually impacts the massing and the plans as you move forward. So labeling something a blue-green street isn't enough if you want to realize what a blue-green street is. You need to show how that's inflected on all of the building and parks to either side of it. The same with mid-block conditions. You talk about mid-block conditions, yet every street view has no mid-block conditions as part of the view. So I'm left wondering what's the quality of the mid-block condition as it meets the street. You talk about it, and it's not an enviable task to increase the density significantly, but then when you push the buildable area towards the street without acknowledging that impacts significantly the experience of the pedestrian walking down that street, it makes me wonder whether your drawings about your new ideas about streets are actually effective. So I think what you need to do is invest in the ideas that you have and show us your vision for why that'll work, and invest that vision back into the plan in terms of the way in which you draw those component elements. I think you've got all the right ingredients, but we need the big cake. Thanks.
Okay, I think no one else online, so I'll do my best to summarize where we are. First of all, thank you for all the work and the presentation. And I'm not going to reiterate all the comments, but I think I'll start with the one that is perhaps most mentioned by many people, is how the river comes into the precinct. And it was sort of your first answer to my question of the picture. And I think that is such a key determinant as to how that river comes in to the precinct, throughout the precinct, how the connections are, the topography, all the issues that you've heard from various panel members. So start with that. I think most people are in support clearly of the park facing the river for obvious reasons, as opposed to being isolated in the middle of the precinct. And I think that relationship can be very, very powerful. It needs to be incredibly strong. You've heard several people say that, and I appreciate your honesty, you don't have an Indigenous consultant as yet. So the answer is get one and work hard with them now, not later. And Matthew certainly can offer suggestions along those lines as to how to best get the best possible, ideas and concepts from the Indigenous perspective that can be weaved into this neighborhood and embedded into this neighborhood. You've heard, remember at our March meeting, we talked about how unique this place is, where the river meets the lake, where this watershed empties out into the lake. And again, the opportunities to celebrate that from an indigenous perspective, as well as every other perspective, is really, really powerful. Another general comment of the importance of a strong east-west link through the entire neighborhood that connects all the way from the river through to Broadview. Again, the ease in which people can access the river from the main street through the entire neighborhood. The importance of a great, powerful retail street. Several people said it is going to be one of the new long city's north-south streets, all the way up from O'Connor all the way down right through. And this is a unique opportunity. It's a wide right-of-way. You've got all kinds of corners, potential opportunities for the angles that are created by it, and they all have to be sort of brought to life and show us what your vision is for the public realm opportunities at all of those block intersections throughout Broadview. I think in answer to one of the questions of how is this plan unique, I think you've gone a long way to create what could be the new typology of mixing this production, creativity, residential kind of character that is going to be next to the film district. We like that, but others have said just make sure you don't have a cookie cutter approach, so every block has this kind of stamp of the same treatment, because it is going to be different if it's done right. All north-south connections obviously are critical. They need to be generous, attractive, green, all of the things that you've heard here that we aspire to. And those connections, someone else said it's important observation, in a way they need to be designed from the inside out. So put yourself in the position of these internal north-south mid-block connections. What are they going to look like? How are they going to feel? What's the relationship to the podiums, the built form, the pedestrian experience? Another panel member made, I think, an interesting observation that it's good, but I'm not energized yet. You need to push the envelope further and don't feel constrained by the so-called rules and regulations of the precinct plan. You can, within that framework, push that envelope further and talk about, how does it relate to the built form? How does this public realm network, north, south, east, west, within this precinct, really energize people who are going to be using it and experiencing it? A couple other points about, is the park in the right place, is an interesting question. I actually initially wondered whether, the park ought to be not only touching
Hi,
the river.
this is Gina. I'm not available right now. Leave.
Good. I honestly wondered whether, in fact, that northwest block, the northwest corner, should be also part of that park framework. The irony is, you've got the tallest building and the highest density, as far as I can recall, in that northwest corner in that block, which is where the river, the watershed empties out. And what are you going to see? The tallest building in the whole precinct. And for me, I thought that it would make sense to have that block an expanded open space and then bleed down into where the park touches the river, as opposed to devote that entire northwest block to a tower, I think was 60 something, 70 stories, something like that. So I would strongly encourage you to think about that and be serious about it. You've been creative in redistributing density throughout through various means, and I think I would love to see your response to that point. There's a couple of last comments here about notwithstanding everything that's been said, there was still a feeling of the sense of sameness that could result from what we've seen so far. So more diversity needed, push the envelope again. The integration of culture, ecology, and movement has been said many times. The experience of the park to the park, the mid-block connections, the conditions we've talked about, the vision for Broadview, show us. Love to see your thinking on that. Same goes with the respect to, or the relationship to the podiums and the overall advancement that you made, I think we appreciate in terms of the blue-green street concept and narrowing the pavement down to as narrow as possible with a wide public realm, which is taking here to the next step. And I think that's to be encouraged. So overall, I think, there are a lot of good ideas, good work, et cetera, but a lot of suggestions. When it comes back, we'd love to see how you respond to all that. So I hope that summarizes what most people said, and I would propose a vote. And I think given the nature of the comments, I would propose a conditional support at this point. Any disagreement? Otherwise, we're in favor, conditional. Okay, all right.
I had just one thing, maybe for this, a question for the city. Like, it's really, you're kind of hamstrung if you're only designing the west side of Broadview. Is there a way to kind of just extend it so that you can think about Broadview holistically? And you may not have to, look at the block structure behind it, but at least the retail and public realm component to the street, because you can make a really nice west side and you have there's nothing, and you're speculating on the east side. But I feel like, it's just a question that it just looks, when I see that dotted line, I go,
Yeah, no, that's a very important
I think that's a good suggestion, even though our first phase official plan amendment and zoning might not cover that. There's no reason that we can't show those areas extras of the plan and how with outside of the boundaries and how they connect. Even using Bouchette as an example, we don't know the final alignment of Bouchette, but we could still talk about that in phase, right? In the first phase.
And the anchoring and the role of McCleary Park, just, again, I understand there's all kinds of extenuating issues that are outside of your control, but I feel like the more you draw it and the more it's there, the more likely it's going to happen. And I just feel like it's just, it's such an anchor. And this is my neighborhood. I know all these parks really well. And so right now, it's kind of where all the baseball guys hang out and all the kind of abandoned trailers are, but it has such potential, and it is defining the whole district. And so I think if you can at least sort of just make sure it's in the drawings, even though it's not your territory, that would help a lot. So thank you.
Okay, so I would give you an opportunity, whoever wants to speak, to respond to what you have heard today. Who's the lucky person?
I don't have much to say other than thank you. I think it's been a very fruitful discussion, a lot of good suggestions, and look forward to coming back. Happy with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. I did want to respond to the comments around the reconciliation action. I'm Eric Sayre with the Waterfront Secretariat. And we are working on sort of exactly what Matthew said, sort of the broader Portland's framework around how we deal with implementing the reconciliation action plan in the Portlands. So we are bringing forward to council in the fall a framework for Indigenous cultural revitalization in the Portlands. And that's sort of what's taking a lot of our resources away. It's to sort of grab the big picture, what Waterfront Toronto is doing, what Great Toronto is doing, and what the city are doing in the Portlands. So that's sort of being done. And that is the piece we're getting into place right now that will then be supporting this work in McCleary, Villiers, the media district. So that work is happening, and it is sort of the focus of the resources. So
okay,
we are trying to do exactly like this thing. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you for that. So no further comments. I believe we are adjourned.